No crime in American history, let alone a crime that never occurred, produced as many trials, convictions, reversals, and retrials as did an alleged gang rape of 2 white girls by 9 black teenagers on a Southern Railway freight run on March 25, 1931. Over the course of the 2 decades that followed, the struggle for justice of the Scottsboro Boys, as the black teens were called, made celebrities out of anonymities, launched and ended careers, wasted lives, produced heroes, opened Southern juries to blacks, exacerbated sectional strife, and divided America's political left. This video is about a story that is often overlooked in history books, but it is one that is both heartbreaking and inspiring. This is the story of the Scottsboro Boys. On March 25, 1931, 9 African-American teenagers were accused of raping 2 white women aboard a Southern Railroad freight train in northern Alabama. Haywood Patterson, Olen Montgomery, Clarence Norris, Willie Roberson, Andy Wright, Ozzie Powell, Eugene Williams, Charley Weems, and Wright were searching for work when a racially charged fight broke out between passengers. The fight is said to have started when a young white man stepped on the hand of one of the Scottsboro Boys. The young white men who were fighting were forced to exit the train. Enraged, they conjured a story of how the black men were at fault for the incident. By the time the train reached Paint Rock, Alabama, the Scottsboro Boys were met with an angry mob and charged with assault. Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, 2 white women who were also riding the freight train, faced charges of vagrancy and illegal sexual activity. In order to avoid these charges, they falsely accused the Scottsboro Boys of rape. Only 4 of the young African-American teens knew each other prior to the incident on the freight train. The teens ranged in age from 13 to 19. None were Alabamans. They were from Georgia and Tennessee. They were heading to towns to seek work with decent wages. 2 of them, Andrew and Leroy Wright, were brothers. They had not been to Scottsboro or were even born there, but as the trials drew increasing regional and national attention, they became known as the Scottsboro Boys. As news spread of the alleged rape, a highly inflammatory charge given the Jim Crow laws in the South, an angry white mob surrounded the jail, leading the local sheriff to call in the Alabama National Guard to prevent a lynching. In the first set of trials in April 1931, an all-white, all-male jury quickly convicted the Scottsboro Boys and sentenced 8 of them to death. The trial of the youngest, 13-year-old Leroy Wright, ended in a hung jury when one juror favored life imprisonment rather than death. A mistrial was declared, and Leroy Wright would remain in prison until 1937, awaiting the final verdict on his co-defendants. The verdict set off protests around the world, organized by the Communist Party of the USA and its legal arm, International Labor Defense, ILD. At that time, the Communists actively organized for workers' rights, especially in the South, on behalf of black workers. In addition to galvanizing public support for their defense through protests, rallies, and letter-writing campaigns, the ILD fought with the NAACP over legally representing the 9, ultimately winning because they'd sought and secured the support of the defendants' mothers. With the ILD's backing, the mothers toured the country and abroad, speaking at rallies encouraging action to overturn the verdicts. That June, the court granted the boys a stay of execution pending an appeal to the Alabama Supreme Court. But in March 1932, the Alabama Supreme Court upheld the convictions of 7 of the defendants. It granted Williams a new trial, as he was a minor at the time of his conviction. In November 1932, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Powell v. Alabama that the Scottsboro defendants had been denied the right to counsel, which violated their right to due process under the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court overturned the Alabama verdict, setting an important legal precedent for enforcing the right of black Americans to adequate counsel, and remanded the cases to the lower courts. Even though they had a new hope for freedom, the retrial process was slow and contentious, despite overwhelming evidence of the boys' innocence. One of the strongest pieces of evidence came from an accuser herself. In early 1932, a letter surfaced from one of the accusers, Ruby Bates. In it, she admitted that her rape claim was a sham. She blamed the Scottsboro police for coercing her into the original accusation. Still, the retrial process dragged on. To show that the county was conducting an unfair trial by denying blacks a place on the jury, prominent defense attorney Samuel Leibowitz, standing for the ILD, called up black leaders from Decatur to testify to the capability of blacks to serve on the jury. Decatur native Francis Tate, the founder of Celebrating Early Old Town with Art, said the Old Town community of Decatur helped to avert potential attacks by the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacists on the defendant's witnesses, as well as the defendant's lawyers. According to press accounts, the home of one black defense witness, E.L. Lewis, was burned to the ground, and he later died from poisoning. Another black defense witness, Frank Sykes, moved to Baltimore because of threats and intimidation. Old Town community members also protected black reporters covering the case so that they could get their stories published. During the trial, the governor brought in the National Guard to provide additional protection, surrounding the courthouse and the jail. Leibowitz also had armed guards accompany him throughout the trials. In 1933, one of the boys, Haywood Patterson, stood retrial in the courtroom of Judge James Horton. His defense attorney called numerous witnesses and built a strong argument that the two girls on the train had lied. Their story did not match medical evidence or the story of other witnesses. On the trial's last day, in a Hollywood-esque twist, Leibowitz pretended to give his closing statement and then called Ruby Bates as a witness for the defense. In her testimony, Bates said the nine did not rape her. Victoria Price had directed her to make the false accusation. Bates and Price did not want to be prosecuted for violating the Mann Act, a law often used as an excuse to arrest blacks. That made it a crime to cross state lines to engage in prostitution or other immoral purposes. Rather than face charges, Price and Bates falsely accused the 9 black teens. The defense seemed inarguable, and yet, after only a few minutes of deliberation, the jury pronounced Patterson guilty and recommended execution. However, Judge James Horton felt it was not justified. He reversed the jury's decision and mandated that the trial restart yet again. Unfortunately, this would cost him his judgeship in the next election. Patterson was not the only one of the Scottsboro Boys to experience stubborn juries in the face of convincing evidence. When another all-white jury convicted Clarence Norris in his retrial, he appealed to the Supreme Court. The 1935 Norris versus Alabama case determined that it was unconstitutional to exclude African Americans from serving on juries for African American defendants. Alabama's jury selection process was inherently racially skewed and violated Norris's 14th Amendment right. Prosecutors got the cases in front of a more sympathetic judge, and both Patterson and Norris were retried, convicted, and sentenced to death in late 1933. With Leibowitz arguing the case for the ILD, the Alabama Supreme Court unanimously denied the defense's motion for new trials, and the case headed for a second hearing in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. In January 1935, the Supreme Court again overturned the guilty verdicts, ruling in Norris versus Alabama that the systematic exclusion of blacks on Jackson County jury rolls denied a fair trial to the defendants and suggesting that the lower courts review Patterson's case as well. This second landmark decision in the Scottsboro Boys case would help integrate future juries across the nation. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, and other civil rights groups joined the ILD that year to form the Scottsboro Defense Committee, which reorganized the defense effort for the next set of retrials. Early in 1936, Patterson was convicted for a fourth time but sentenced to 75 years in prison. The day after the verdict, Ozzie Powell was shot in the head after attacking a deputy sheriff with a knife. Both men survived. After the Alabama Supreme Court upheld Patterson's conviction in June, and Norris's third trial ended in another death sentence, Andy Wright and Weems were both convicted of rape and sentenced to long prison terms as well. Through negotiations with the defense, prosecutors agreed to drop rape charges against Powell, but he was convicted of assaulting the deputy sheriff and sentenced to 20 years. They also dropped rape charges against the 4 remaining defendants, Montgomery, Roberson, Williams, and Leroy Wright, and all 4 were released. Alabama Governor Bibb Graves commuted Norris's sentence to life imprisonment in 1938 and denied pardon applications by all 5 convicted defendants that same year. Over the next 12 years, the remaining 5 also made it out of the prison system, usually by receiving parole. Haywood Patterson, however, accomplished an impressive escape in 1948. Years later, in 2013, the Alabama Board of Pardons and Paroles granted posthumous pardons to 3 of the Scottsboro Boys who never had their convictions overturned: Charles Weems, Andrew Wright, and Haywood Patterson. The Scottsboro incident was one of the earliest signs of the need for racial justice in the U.S. It garnered media attention for several years, and racial equality groups such as the Communist Party USA and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, capitalized on the cases to win support for their cause. If the Scottsboro Boys story sounds familiar, it might be because the saga partially inspired two famous novels, Richard Wright's Native Son and Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. Lee's novel in particular has some key similarities. In the novel, a black man was accused of raping a white woman, and the book's protagonist is 6 years old, about the same age as Lee, during the first Scottsboro trial. One reason the Scottsboro Boys repeatedly appear in literature and pop culture is that their story clearly demonstrates one of the darkest days for blacks in America's history. But the legacy of the Scottsboro Boys case is not just a historical one. The story of these 9 teenagers serves as a reminder of the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America. The issues of systemic racism and police brutality continue to plague society today, and it is up to each and every one of us to work toward a more just and equitable society. Thank you for watching this video. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more content.